Hello, and welcome to the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book, presenting Sowing, Care, and Justice. I'm Jane Kulo, Director of the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. Thanks for joining us. A couple of notes before we begin. Please share your questions for the authors using the Q&A tab on Zoom. This event has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at any time with the tab at the bottom of your window. If you haven't already read today's book, we hope you will. For details about how to buy it from a local bookseller, visit vabook.org, where you can also explore the schedule of upcoming programs and watch past events. While you're there, please consider making a donation to support the festival's ongoing work through vabook.org/give. I'd like to thank our community partners for this event, Black Women Stitch and Dairy Market, for sharing information. And also thanks to our bookseller for this event, UVA Bookstore. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Mai-Linh Hong, co-editor of the Auntie Sewing Squad Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and Racial Justice, is assistant professor of Asian diaspora and Asian American literature at the University of California, Merced. She earned her JD and PhD degrees at the University of Virginia. Chrissy Yi Lau, co-editor of the Auntie Sewing Squad Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and Racial Justice, is assistant professor of history at California State University, Monterey Bay. She writes histories on race, gender, religion, and empire. She also researches and develops museum exhibitions for the public and digital exhibitions through the classroom. Valerie Soe, contributor to the Auntie Sewing Squad Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and Racial Justice, is a writer and experimental video maker living and working in San Francisco. Our moderator today, Alissa Ujie Diamond, is a mask maker, a PhD candidate, a mom, a landscape architect, and an artist in Charlottesville, Virginia. Thank you all for joining us today. Alissa, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jane. We are so honored to have you join us today in Charlottesville, members of the Auntie Sewing Squad. We're here to discuss the book, Auntie Sewing Squad, Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and Racial Justice, a book I've been so glad to be introduced to as part of this festival. And to be honest, when I read it, I felt at times like I was looking in a mirror. A book with so many pieces written by Asian American women who are all frustrated and activated by the systemic failures exacerbated by the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. I, like you, reacted with sewing and found myself informed by my historical, generational ties to sewing and mask making, my political commitments to social justice as they manifested through my processes of making, and the networks and social connections that grew out of these supply shortages, fabric sourcing problems, and really just caring for each other in the face of really dramatic institutional failures and neglect. So this book, first I will say, is amazing. And we'll start with each of the three Auntie editors today speaking a little bit about the book. So we'll start with you, Mai-Linh.
Thank you so much, Alissa, and thanks so much to the organizers of the book festival. I spent about a decade in Charlottesville, so I'm really thrilled to be back here, even virtually. It means a lot to me. So I'm Mai-Linh. I'm a sewing auntie in the Auntie Sewing Squad, as well as one of the book's editors. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about the organization, the work that we did, and the book project. So the Auntie Sewing Squad started in March of 2020 at the start of the pandemic, when it became clear that masks were going to be part of the public health response. It wasn't clear yet to the US government, but it was clear to a lot of folks who were paying attention. And it was started by performance artist Christina Wong, who lives in Los Angeles, who put out a call on Facebook, just a friendly call saying, hey, if anybody needs a mask, I could make one for you with my Hello Kitty sewing machine. And she got completely flooded with requests and eventually had to assemble a crew of aunties via Facebook. And this crew grew into a nationwide network. So eventually we had about 800 aunties who were fulfilling requests. And this turned into a major logistical and production operation. But I think what really set it apart was that there were other mask making groups at the time who were trying to serve essential workers and frontline workers. But fairly quickly, it became clear to the Auntie Sewing Squad folks that the impacts of the pandemic were vastly unequal across communities in the United States, and that there were many communities that were much harder hit. And so that even when the supply chain issues got worked out for healthcare workers, essential workers, were able to access masks, that there were many communities, especially Indigenous and communities of color, that were not able to access the materials that they needed. So eventually, the Sewing Squad reached all over the country, and we pretty much turned to serving carefully vetted organizations that were working on the ground with Native reservations, with communities that were underserved, and it became a way for many of us in the squad to not only meet a public health need that was very clear to us, but also to protest the unequal treatment of various communities, as well as just the failure of the US government to intervene in a pandemic that was clearly going to be disastrous for many communities. So this is a map of the squad. And as you can see, there are certain hubs, certain areas where there are aunties clustered together. We organized through a group on Facebook. And as the group grew, it just became really tremendous how we were able to make connections across all of this geographic space. You can see that at the bottom corner, it says that there were 250,000 masks donated in 2020. I think by the time the group retired in August of 2021, we had donated at least 350,000 masks. And so this was aunties working at home on their sewing machines, sourcing fabric, cutting materials for each other. Aunties had lots of different roles, as well as our super aunties who handled the enormous logistical feat of getting these masks to where they needed to be. So to give you an idea, we had an amazing artist, Audrey Chan, work with us on the book project to illustrate, just how the squad worked and some of the scenes from our mask production. This is a chart of some of the roles in the Auntie Sewing Squad. And you'll see Christina up here, who we affectionately and ironically called our overlord, threatening us that if we don't keep sewing, well, she'll cut off our fingers, which turned out to be kind of a gesture of affection. But there was a lot of dark humor in the group, and we can definitely talk about that and how humor sort of helped us get through some of these tough times. But I think this chart really conveys just how frenetic some of this work was. We were working really hard for an extended period of time. It was completely unsustainable, but it was work that was very motivated by values, by what we saw as a need in communities that we cared about at the time. And just as a funny note, to make some of these illustrations, some of us gave Audrey photos of our workspaces at home so that she could have an idea of what things looked like. And in the corner, in the bottom right corner here, you'll see a rendering of my then 3-year-old son holding wire cutters, which was just a testament to my pandemic parenting at a time when all of the daycares were closed. So that's Milo holding wire cutters. And you'll see that there's a care auntie, which I'll talk about in a moment, fabric auntie, elastic auntie, all of the materials that we were using that we were really in need of were very much in short supply for a time in 2020. And so these were not easy tasks to provide all of the materials that were necessary to the aunties. And to give you an idea of where our work went, this is a little bit of an outdated chart, but I think that the proportions probably do hold. So as you can see, our masks went to organizations serving migrants and asylum seekers, Indigenous nations, First Nations, unhoused and incarcerated people, environmental justice organizations. There was an amazing migrant seasonal Head Start program that worked with migrant immigrant farm worker families. And so we made child-sized masks for them. Farm workers in California, especially during the summer fire season, were a huge community that we were trying to partner with to make sure that they had materials that they needed. We also provided N95s because that was necessary during fire season. So low-wage essential workers, frontline workers were also in the mix. And one of the things that set our group apart, I think, was there was a real ethic of care within the group that came along with the recognition that the work that we were doing was extractive and exploitative labor. We were not romanticizing it as like, patriotic effort or as, some kind of a glorified, volunteer project. We were very aware all the time that this was work that came out of systemic inequities that were that had caused the unequal harm that was happening to communities. And so we as workers within that context also made sure to value our own labor and our own contributions and make sure that we were taking care of each other. So there was actually a very elaborate system of auntie care in which many aunties who were not sewing aunties, and there were many, many different roles, and care aunties, were making crafts, providing food, teaching yoga classes, doing all sorts of things to make sure that we recognized each other, really saw the work that each other was doing, and tried to provide as much care as we could during that time. So the book project came about, kind of organically, that my co-editors, Chrissy Lau, Preeti Sharma, and I had the opportunity to work with Christina Wong, Valerie Soe, Rebecca Solnit, and some other folks, and with the University of California Press to put together a book that would document this really extraordinary mutual aid effort, as well as, for Chrissy, Preeti, and I, especially as scholars of ethnic studies and Asian American studies, we really wanted to put this work, this effort, into context as a racial justice effort. And so the book eventually had over 50 aunties contributing to it. It's based around 5 critical essays that are on the core themes of labor, solidarity, survival, mutual aid, and posterity. Posterity referring to the teaching of sewing and of the kinds of care and compassion that we were working with. The book contains creative writing, visual art, recipes, all sorts of things. And I think the sort of the mishmash of materials and genres really reflects how diverse the group was. Really, we were primarily led and by women of color in the organization, and specifically a lot of Asian American women. And we reflected very much on the fact that as women of color, that our labor, the forms of care labor have been extracted from our communities in an exploitative way throughout American history, and just in the global economy as well. And so our place within that structure does show up in the book as part of our critical context for thinking about the pandemic and our work during that time. So just to show you a couple of images from the book, one of our fabric aunties, shopping, Candace Kim, shopping for fabric. We had aunties going out looking for bargains, and during a time when fabric was in pretty short supply. And the other picture you see is our Auntie Dora, who was sewing masks, as many of us were sewing masks for Black Lives Matter protesters during a time when those were going on and very much on our minds. And I'll show you just one more image. This is our Auntie Sanaya, a beautiful watercolor self-portrait. Auntie Sanaya was a sewing auntie in the group and was doing a daily watercolor project. And as the pandemic went on, her artwork started to manifest the kinds of work that we were doing in response to the pandemic as well. So I'll just say a word about my own part in the book. I wrote an essay called Survival, Sewing as Refuge, which reflects on my position as a Vietnamese American refugee who learned to sew from her refugee mother, as well as my conversations with another Vietnamese refugee uncle in the group, Van Nguyen, who works on behalf of formerly incarcerated people, and he himself is a former incarceree. And we very much believed that our experiences as refugees really influenced how we viewed the mutual aid work and our understanding of our role during this really difficult time. So I'll pass it on to Chrissy to tell you a little more about the themes of the book and her contributions.
Thank you, Mai-Linh. And thank you so much to all of the organizers of this festival. I'm so happy to be here and talk about the Auntie Sewing Squad Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and Racial Justice. I am one of the co-editors, and I'm going to take the time to talk about why I joined the Auntie Sewing Squad and how that really inspired my approach to my chapter, which is the second chapter of the book, entitled Sowing with Intent. And it's in the solidarity theme of the book. I remember in March of 2020, I was feeling really angry and anxious when some of the first cases of COVID-19 hit US shores. And I was mostly angry that the US government was spreading misinformation and we're not properly preparing folks to protect themselves with proper PPE against COVID-19. So like other folks, I was doom scrolling on Facebook, and luckily I was friends with Christina Wong, and I've been a big fan of her work. And I saw that she started sewing masks on her Hello Kitty sewing machine. And she even made a post offering that if anyone needed a mask, that she would be happy to send them a mask. So I was just really inspired, and I started to sew my own masks. And at that time, I was really just hand sewing. And I started sewing masks for loved ones near me and ones that I could mail masks to. So I joined the Auntie Sewing Squad largely to get access to a lot of the resources that they had, like elastic and fabric, resources that were just really hard to find at that time. So I would say that I became a really active member of the Auntie Sewing Squad when I saw that, unlike other mask making groups that were primarily sending masks to essential workers and to hospitals, the squad really began to make organized campaigns to prioritize sending masks to BIPOC communities who would be negatively impacted by COVID-19 and the government's mishandling of it. So in one of the first campaigns, the Auntie Sewing Squad organized a 5,000 mask campaign to be sent to Navajo Nation, a community who were already under-resourced because the US government failed to keep their promises of ensuring medical health care and education in exchange for the cession of their land. And they were now going to be even more negatively impacted by COVID-19. So when I saw that the Auntie Sewing Squad intentionally pivoted to serving Native American communities, and the first campaign was to call for 5,000 masks, I thought, this is my chance to contribute. This is my opportunity. And so I pledged to make 25 masks, and that was when I stepped up my game and I purchased a sewing machine. And I got donated fabric, and I got elastic from the Elastic Hub, which was Auntie Valerie Soe at that time. And I watched tutorials on how to use a sewing machine. And I texted Mai-Linh about like things that like I made mistakes with on the sewing machine. And I was able to make my first set of 25 masks to be sent out. So I was really initially attracted to the squad's approach of solidarity, not charity. So when we think of charity, charity is oftentimes a top-down approach to the distribution of resources, where a really prominent example is like rich philanthropists donating and most of the time dictating how their monetary contributions will be spent and will be dispersed. But in contrast, the approach of solidarity is a more horizontal structure, with mutual cooperation between communities. So the communities that we're serving always has a seat at the table, always helps to make the decisions of how the resources will be dispersed and spent. So the Auntie Sewing Squad practices solidarity, not charity, by organizing with communities in need and prioritizes a redistribution of resources because of specific histories of colonialism, racism, and state violence. And so my attraction to Auntie Sewing Squad's approach of solidarity, not charity, really was propelled by kind of my many years of studying and thinking through solidarity. And my undergraduate training is in Asian American studies. So I am someone who is really kind of a beneficiary of the early 1960s third world social movements that established ethnic studies. And so one of my main moments that I always think about when I think about solidarity is in the 1960s when Asian Americans decided to reject the model minority and instead organize alongside with Black and Brown students in order to call for an education that reflected their histories and their politics. Given that history of thinking about the development of politics, I am a historian by training, and I study the development of women's politics. So in my chapter entitled Solidarity, Sewing with Intent, I was really interested in examining how aunties developed their politics around solidarity prior to joining the squad and how this informed their practice of solidarity through the Auntie Sewing Squad. So I conducted various oral history interviews and I used the archive of Facebook. And I found that the Auntie Sewing Squad really draws from a lineage of solidarity organizing from earlier social movements, as well as ethnic studies, training and background and education. And through both of these, that we developed an Asian American feminist solidarity proxies that really centers introspection as a core value. And when I say introspection, I found that we really centered introspection like listening to Native American communities since they had long been not listened, or the government has not listened to them and has not made good on their promises. Another one I found was collaborating with organizations, especially with organizations that have long been working with communities on the ground and have much more knowledge and experience than we do. And so collaboration with them without burdening them was central to our work. And then finally, thinking through our own kind of political reckoning. When the Auntie Sewing Squad dedicated a day in solidarity with the Black Lives Matters movement, that was a day that we were thinking about educating our own selves, like especially for the non-Black aunties, to educate ourselves on how we are complicit with unequal incarceration policies and the prison industrial complex, our own complicities that devalue Black lives. I will be happy to talk more about my chapter, but I'm going to pass it on to Valerie Soe.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting all of us. We're so excited to be here at the book festival. So I am trained as a filmmaker and a visual artist. And one of the things I really love about our book is that it has many different modes of access, right? There's like longer scholarly and thoughtful historical essays, but also there's a whole bunch of like recipes and photos and graphs and pictures. And one thing that I really appreciate is that there's also replications of some of the Facebook conversations that we had, because that was really how we built community in our group, is by communicating on Facebook. In fact, I was about to leave Facebook just because of their awful politics. And then Christina started this group and I had to stay. So I think that to me is a really great thing about the book, is that there's a lot of ways you can enter it. I joined the Auntie Sewing Squad pretty early because Christine is a friend of mine, Christina Wong. And one of the things that happened at the very beginning, which the other two speakers have referenced, is that the supply chain was really hard. There wasn't a lot of fabric and there wasn't a lot of elastic and so forth. So at some point, someone, I think my friend Grace Yu, said, let's make the ties to the masks out of conference lanyards. And so you can see there it is behind me. So I made a little short video about that. It's about 2 minutes long, and I'm going to share that with you guys right now. I'm just going to do a share screen, but I will also paste in the link just in case people want to watch it again, in case there's any kind of issues with the jagginess. Oh wait, I don't know if I can actually share in the chat, but okay. So I'm going to do my share screen. And like I said, it's about 2 minutes long and it should be relatively okay. Where did it go? Oh, there it is. I'm not quite sure how. Somehow I got involved with a sewing circle that Christina Wong organized on Facebook sometime around mid-March 2020. The COVID-19 crisis had just started to take over our lives in the US. And due to the criminal negligence of the Trump administration, hospital workers had little or no personal protective equipment available. So Christina started sewing masks for those frontliners, and I joined in. Pretty soon after that, due to the huge leap in demand, there was a run on elastic for masks, and we started looking for alternatives. Some people were making their own ties out of strips of fabric or using the plundered elastic from fitted bed sheets. But my friend Grace Yu suggested using lanyards cut from conference badges, which suited me a bit better since it didn't require any extra sewing or handwork. So I rummaged through my stash of conference and film festival badges and came up with a respectable pile of about 20 lanyards. My favorite ones were from CampFest, since they were the right width and pliancy, and they're a nice teal color. Because that's how I do, I then went on social media and solicited lanyards from my friends and acquaintances. And soon I had a huge box of lanyards. But I'm happy to repurpose everyone's film festival detritus and put them to good use. While I'm sewing, I think of the person I'm sewing for, although sometimes I know who the mask is for and sometimes I don't. I try to envision their face, hear their voice, think about what their favorite colors are. The masks are talismans against illness, danger, fear. A bit of goodwill to help folks survive these uncertain times. And it makes me feel good to be offering them to people who need them. I don't know how long we're going to have to wear masks when we go outside, but as of this moment, there are still too many people who don't have a mask or who aren't wearing them. So I'll keep sewing them and keep giving them away as long as we need them. Okay, of course we didn't keep sewing as long as the people needed them because, we retired a few months ago. Whoopsie, oh shoot. But, sorry, hold on, I gotta, hang on, wait.
Valerie, I think we lost your sound.
Yeah, I had to mute because the autoplay was playing the other clip. Anyway, but so but I did want to say that we started out as these solitary sewers, and by the end of the group, by the end of when we retired, there were like 800 people involved. So it was really a wonderful, really fabulous community, and so many great things have come out of it, including this book, including a documentary which I'm going to be making a longer project about, including many book talks and visits to colleges and conferences and so forth, and also connections with all the different community groups. We're still sending supplies to Navajo Nation and to Team Brownsville for folks who are on the border who are crossing into the United States and so forth. So it's really become an amazing, amazing thing. Yeah. So I really love that even though we may not be sewing masks specifically the way we used to, we still do have this legacy that lives on.
Amazing. Thank you all for those really there's such great different synopsises of the book from three kind of really different perspectives on like talking about the development of the project. I have one, well, first of all, I want to say to the audience that we are taking questions both via the chat and by the Q&A. So if you have questions for Auntie Sewing Squad, we'd love to hear them. In the meantime, I'll start with my questions selfishly. But the first one I have is it's a really kind of obvious question given the title of the book. But you all talk a lot about the figure of auntie and like there's some really interesting critiques and traditions that that term relates to. So I'm wondering if you all could talk about that a little bit.
Everyone is so shy. I mean, I think Christina used that partially in an ironic way, but in a very affectionate way too, when she named the group, which was very quickly. She didn't really think about what she was going to name the group. And of course, she always says, you know, she had no idea what the acronym was when she named the group. So, but, you know, in Asian culture, especially a lot of Asian cultures, the idea that you just name anybody who is of your parents' generation, who's a female, right, a woman-born woman or a female body person as an auntie. And even some of the ones who are not female bodied people in our group chose that name auntie because they really wanted to just think about those kin relationships and how it was so important to acknowledge, you know, generational influences and how those who came before us have enabled us to do what we do now, have given us the privilege of being scholars and writers and artists and so forth by doing hard labor and working in sewing factories and restaurants and so forth.
I think it's worth noting that there were aunties of all genders. And so the term auntie very much recognizes the gendered care labor that we were doing and the sort of the social context in which we were doing, you know, like sewing, caring for each other, caring for other people, trying to preserve health. But at the same time, like our community was full of aunties, uncles, aunties, folks who had used even other titles. And auntie itself for us wasn't necessarily just about being women in that role, but rather being in that position of just caring for people outside of like a sort of the nuclear family unit.
I also want to add that I think we also drew from a lineage of revolutionary aunties. So aunties that participated in social movements, but have really not gotten a lot of recognition in history because they centered a more center person kind of leadership rather than a spokesperson leadership. So in the book, we talk about drawing from our lineage of revolutionary aunties like Yuri Kochiyama, Grace Lee Boggs, and Grandma Kim, like all folks who really practiced and showed solidarity with multiple communities of color and really practiced a kind of center person leadership where they're bridging communities, they're doing a lot of the behind the scenes work, they're caring for other folks. And so I think that model was something that we combine this model of care figure that's often familial with our kind of revolutionary values and social movement values.
Amazing. Yeah, and I love the term too, because I mean, I was reflecting on my own experience reading the various kind of angles on the auntie terminology. And like, it made me really think through the fact that some of my most isolating moments were at the beginning of the pandemic, and often was realizing that the way my isolation was structured very much revolved around the construct of the nuclear family and the ways that my relationship to structures were like mediated through that structure. And so, you know, sitting alone in my basement and deciding to sew like came from that kind of frustrated isolation that you were talking about earlier, Chrissy. So I just love that term. Kind of to add on to that question, I mean, you each have talked a little bit about kind of like the book itself really talks about like May through November of 2020. And it's incredible because it is this like really multimodal, you know, recipes, there's graphic contributions, there's poetry, there's the Facebook feed. that I think like is like such an amazing documentation of just 8 months of a kind of ongoing organizing ecosystem. But I found too that in my own experience, like with the supply chain failures, I ended up finding elastic, but not being able to find fabric. And so instead asked women around me, like similar to how you did, Valerie, asking women around me, like, do you all have any fabric stashed into your basements? And it ended up people gave me so much fabric that I still have a pile left. And still people are telling me stories about like their grandmothers who like they had never been able to let go of this fabric before this moment where they felt like, oh, this is going to go to something that's really important. So I'm curious if you all had those kinds of experiences, like either connecting back to places that you had been. Mai-Linh, I know you like spent some time here in Virginia, or to your own family kind of longer trajectories, or to other communities that had these kind of longer organizing trajectories that like came out of those kind of logistical issues. And can we start with Valerie on that question?
Oh, sure. I mean, just thinking about that fabric supply thing, one of the things that was really great is that people would ask their parents and their moms and their, everybody about their family. But one of the nicest donations I feel I got was from a Nisei sewing group, a second generation Japanese American sewing group who were quilters. And they heard about our group and they said, well, we're not really meeting in person anymore because the senior center's not having, so we got all these boxes of fabric. Can you possibly use them? And they're like, yeah, because we were very desperate for fabric for a long time. And the thing about getting fabric from quilters is that it's really beautiful fabric patterns and also high quality. And it was very nice to pass it along to folks who, maybe I feel like I always thought maybe some of these Nisei quilters had been incarcerated during World War II. And so it would be great for them to support folks who are, on the border coming in from being stuck in the, detainment centers and so forth. Or farm workers too, same thing, a lot of Nisei were farm workers. So it was kind of nice to make those historical connections and those community connections in that way.
Yeah, we were sourcing fabric from so many different places in all different quantities too, which was really interesting because there were periods where we were, our fabric aunties were making deals with like, large fabric suppliers where we would get pallets of fabric that required forklifts and people with trucks to transport them, and then someone with a large garage to store them. And, it was a real operation. But then, like Valerie's saying, there were all of these exchanges with smaller amounts of fabric or community-based donations. We got quite a bit of fabric from Alao Temple in California that these were fabric that was used to make robes for monks, for Buddhist monks. And so many of us got fabric through that source. I still have a little bit of that fabric. It means a lot to me. I grew up in a Buddhist family, and being Southeast Asian, there's a lot of history there and a lot of history in the sort of the shared diasporic history. So many of us have fabric stories, and it's just very meaningful to be working with your hands with that fabric that has a history, that is a connection, a physical connection to somewhere, and to share that connection and that care with whoever receives the mask. Just as a real quick story, I was giving away masks from my front porch in central Pennsylvania where I was living at the time, and people would leave anonymous donations of supplies, which was fantastic because of the shortages and everything. One day I came out and there was a huge cardboard box full of lace, like lace trims, just yards and yards of it, and all these spools. I mean, there were like, it was thousands of yards of lace, and some of it was like yellowing. They were very old. And I just thought, like, somebody collected this over a whole lifetime. Like somebody's grandmother passed away and they're passing this on to me. And I was like, I have no idea what to do with it because it is lace and I don't know what to do with it. But then I ran out of elastic and I started using the lace as mask ties. So there actually was, were a few batches of masks. And then at a certain point, I just couldn't use them for masks anymore. And I gave them to one of our care aunties, and she started incorporating them into these stuffed I'm not even sure what to call it, but these fish-shaped objects that she was making as gifts that were embroidered with names and stuff, like sort of souvenir type objects. And so she started putting lace on them from this box of lace. So this really, every single thing we made was a physical like manifestation of the connections that we were making during this really isolating time.
To add on, there were definitely some donations and lineages and traditions that we did not want to continue on. And so, for instance, I actually received donated fabric from a colleague, and in that donated fabric, there were some fabrics that I was really uncomfortable with. Like one of them had a cowboy and Indians theme, and then another one had like this multicultural theme that showed Chinese people with slanted eyes. And so I think we were really intentional in not trying to reproduce some of those fabrics. So thinking about honoring our relationship to the communities that we serve, we asked them to kind of prioritize their needs and prioritize what would help humanize them and observe their dignity. And so with Native American communities, we had to be very careful about the fabric choice that we used. We could not use anything that culturally appropriated their culture. So we had to stay away from like racist themes. And then there were also others that we really had to kind of honor their dignity. Like for farm workers, many of them are out, working for how many long hours in a day. And so many of them did not prefer like the ties around the ears, but they preferred the ties around the head. And many of them are also primarily male. And so they might not necessarily like patterns with cats on their face, like while they're farming. So they preferred kind of solid colors. So we were trying to be intentional with the kinds of fabrics that we did use to make our masks, not because we're like an Etsy shop. We're not trying to cater and respond to consumer demands, but we're trying to observe the dignity of these communities.
Wow, yes, this is bringing up memories from that 1 year period, similar experiences with some fabrics that literally came out of people's basements and grandmother's stashes that, yeah, super problematic. I guess on that kind of a similar theme of like breaking harmful cycles or thinking about how you're making informed kind of systems change in the world, in instantiating the worlds that we want. I would love to talk a little bit more about in our mask making efforts in Charlottesville, I grappled a lot, especially with other women of color, about our roles as providers of undervalued labor and like this kind of tension between the kind of wonderful aspects of what we were doing, kind of like you described, Valerie, in your video of like, even just imagining the care that we are able to share with someone through making a mask, and that being a very important thing just to survive ourselves for the during the pandemic, but also that like our labor historically and presently is really often used to prop up systems that are broken and to allow things to continue to function. So I'd love maybe starting with Mai-Linh, for you all to kind of talk about how you all grappled with that as a group, and how you came to decisions about how you deal with that.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a great question and something that we were talking about throughout the book project as well as throughout our work. And I guess one way to start thinking about it is that, we consider this a mutual aid project. This was not a charity organization. And as Chrissy was saying before, we were trying to practice a kind of solidarity that was about collaboration and mutual support. Mutual aid often comes through a shared experience or sort of a visceral shared experience of inequality. So mutual aid is not necessarily like the privileged giving to the less privileged, but it very often is communities that have been left behind by the larger systems that we live in, that are trying to help each other. And so that idea of shared labor, shared care, and mutual support also sits alongside the history of exploitative labor that many of us were caught up in. Like, so many of the aunties are from families of garment workers, from, had mothers who worked in sweatshops, who, we all came from histories that gave us a very visceral understanding of that care. And I think it was just really important that we were very overt, very open about our politics, that we did this work because it needed to be done. And we did this work because the people we were providing masks to deserve to be cared for, because they are people, they are part of our community, they're important to us. And it was important for us to say, we're doing this because the powers that be have failed. And so that message was always very clear. And I think that was always a motivating force for us.
I think we talk a lot about that idea of rage sewing and how angry so many of us were, and frustrated. And, it was very, selfishly, it was very therapeutic for me to be able to get on the machine and just do something, like make something, and not just stew in my own rage. So we did have that idea of rage sewing. After George Floyd was killed, we had a campaign where we sent masks to the NAACP in the town that the city he was from. And we really said we're sewing with intent for this campaign. And we put all of our energy into that. And we got some really great thank you notes back from the NAACP about that. And it was wonderful. Because I feel like that they felt maybe people were thinking of them in this difficult time as well, so.
Amazing. I'm going to share a question that's not really a question, but I think it's a beautiful comment, and I want to share it from Akasha Tolbert. So it's not a question, but just praise from a poet and wannabe quilter in Charlottesville. So much resonance between the Sewing Squad and such wide lineages of community care. I think the Black Panther Party and its Free People's Medical Clinics, also the United Order of Tents and 1867 Secret Society of Black Virginia Nurses, who took care of folks across a five-state network. I'm moved by shared practices and grateful for you all being here. So I thought that required some airtime. So great. And a question from Angie Knobloch. Can you talk a little bit about how you funded your work?
Sure, yeah. So the Auntie Sewing Squad in the initial stages didn't really have a funding structure, because it was sort of, everybody was just trying to get things going. And so we were working with donated fabric. We ourselves were buying materials. And of course, that was not sustainable, especially as the group grew. But we did have some aunties who had friends or colleagues who wanted to support the work of the group. And we started getting monetary donations. We needed a fiscal sponsor for that. Like, the group just got sort of more and more elaborate as we went along. And so Christina Wong and the super aunties were kind of scrambling to figure out like the right structure to make sure that all of this was above board, and that we could keep track of everything and use the money very responsibly. So we did get quite a bit of donated funding from folks through a fiscal sponsor. And the way it worked was then there were certain types of materials or certain expenses that could be reimbursed through the group. So if aunties spent money on fabric or elastic or postage, then we had a system to get reimbursed from Christina. So she was sort of handling the finances for that. But yeah, I think there was probably a lot of expenditure that happened outside of that structure that never really got accounted for, because we honestly were just working as fast as we could.
That makes sense. So we're creeping up on the end of the hour. So I'm just going to ask you all one more question. But so when I opened the book, and I looked at the table of contents, as I always do before I start reading, there was a section where I was like, huh? And it was the posterity section. I think mostly in part because my experience of the time of mask making was like that picture you shared, Mai-Linh, like super frenetic and also incredibly ephemeral. Like, material came into my house, I sewed it, and I like gave it away, and therefore there wasn't like a lot to show. But I love if you all would talk about the posterity section and why you thought that was important. And Chrissy, I'm going to start with you with this one, if you don't mind.
Thank you for the question. Our posterity section was really inspired by one of our other aunties, Grace Yu, She is a professor at San Francisco State University, and she started, so she joined the Auntie Sewing Squad, and she actually created a sewing class at San Francisco State University over the summer. And so she had several students take her class, and they soon became part of the Auntie Sewing Squad. So in that chapter, Grace Yu reflects on some of the lessons that she learned, because she was also a first-time sewer, and some of the lessons that she passed on. And so in that class, she actually had aunties come visit and speak with the students. And the students also contributed masks to the campaigns. And they also received auntie care. And they also did oral histories with aunties. So actually in that section, there are some really great oral histories between the students and the aunties. And so we really wanted to dedicate a section to this idea of teaching others how to sew and teaching others compassion and care. And then also some of the other creative writing pieces are how aunties reflect on how they learned to sew and kind of generational connections that they made in terms of like what we had talked about earlier. And just like learning lessons and then teaching on and passing on some of the values that we centered in the Auntie Sewing Squad and that we want to pass on to other folks who sew.
So inspired by Grace's class, I actually, I taught an Asian American literature class in the fall of 2020 and incorporated a community engaged learning portion into it, where the students also learned how to sew masks by hand and then sewed masks for donation. And I think what was really important for all of us in the group, and especially the aunties who were scholars and teachers, was that we didn't teach sewing as like sort of a Rosie the Riveter patriotic effort kind of narrative, but rather we taught the social context in which we were doing this mutual aid work. So we taught about the racial landscape, the social landscape, and the inequities that created the need. We were always aware of the politics, and we wanted students to be focusing their care and compassion in a way that matched with their values and that was engaged with the environment that we were living in.
I don't know if I have anything to add to that, but I am working with the students who worked with Grace to do little clips for the documentary. So they're going to hopefully have their own little stories for posterity as well. They did also spearhead a drive for incarcerated people at San Quentin prison here in San Francisco too, which was really great. I think they got 1,500 masks or something. It was a large number. Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Oh, well, super looking forward to the documentary. And for you all, if you have any social media tags or links to any of your other work that relates to Auntie Sewing Club, please put them in the chat so we have them for everybody to see. And yeah, since we're getting close to 1, I think we'll close. You know, it's time for us to wrap things up. So thank you so much to Mai-Linh, Chrissy, and Valerie, and everybody who tuned in. Definitely consider getting this book from your local bookseller. There are links provided at virginiabook.org or through the links in the chat. You can also explore the rest of the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book schedule, which runs through March 20th at virginiabook.org. And keep an eye out for the amazing kimchi recipe in this book. I'm excited to try it as soon as I can get my hands on some cabbage. So thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure talking with you today.